Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most graceful, the most merciful. A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2020 UAE Public Policy Forum. My name is Yusuf Abdul Bari. I am a Dubai-based broadcast journalist and presenter. And it is my honor to welcome you to this platform, which is held under the patronage of His Highness Sheikh Hamdan bin Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, Crown Prince of Dubai and Chairman of the Executive Council. Ladies and gentlemen, the strategic partner for this year's event is Mohammed bin Rashid Center for Government Innovation. We would like to thank them for their unique input and insight. Plus, to kill two birds with one stone, it would be a lovely attendance check and to get calories burning in our system. A round of applause for our strategic partner. Thank you very much. No doubt the participation from your counterpart to every panel and impulse session on this platform is going to be quite enthusiastic, so we look forward to that. Ladies and gentlemen, the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government launched the UAE Public Policy Forum in 2017 as an annual knowledge and discussion platform for leaders and decision makers from federal and local government entities across the globe. Now, this year, as it always does, MBRSG aims to showcase the trends, both lessons and failures, in the best public policy practices and regulations, in their design and implementation, and hence to add to the knowledge and agenda to create an agile government and become future-proof. Over the next 2 days, ladies and gentlemen, this forum will shed light on this unique theme, agile government becoming future-proof, by addressing several pillars in various panels, guest talks, and workshops. We will be exploring and developing an innovative approach to enhance governmental performance and the UAE's soft power standing on the global stage. We will be starting shortly, ladies and gentlemen, but before that, we would just like to mention a few brief but important housekeeping notes, so bear with me. First up, ladies and gentlemen, all of the sessions that will be held here will be relayed to you in English. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, please be advised that English to Arabic translation service is going to be provided, and you may refer to it by, of course, the not disposable, but the provided translation headsets given to you, or at least at the entrance of this hall. The school has produced several publications which perfectly complement the respective pillars of the discussions we will be having over the next 2 days. Now, these publications are not available in paper copy, ladies and gentlemen, which aligns with the Dubai paperless strategy, which embodies our leadership's vision for a smart government that embraces advanced technologies to build a perfectly integrated paperless government. That is the goal, of course. Another housekeeping note, ladies and gentlemen, each panel will have a dedicated moderator who will steer the conversation. If that moderator is opening up the discussion to questions from the audience, they will announce it in due time. So hold those hands and pencils. We encourage you to engage, of course, with these discussions, topics on social media as well. Now, the official hashtag for doing so, you can write it on your hand if you don't trust that mine. It is UAE PPF 2020. You will see the hashtag, of course, right here on the screen behind me through the event in both Arabic and English. Please keep your mobile phones on silent mode, as I have did, so not to disturb our speakers, of course. Now, we may have polls to find out what your opinions are. The QR codes will be displayed on the screen as well, and we encourage you, of course, to participate. And as a quick explanation of the forum program over the next 2 days, ladies and gentlemen, there will be a panel discussion by a range of experts in that field. Following this panel, you are welcomed to attend an impulse, a guest talk covering various different topics, or alternatively, you can join the workshops. We will keep you informed as to the topics for the discussion panels, impulses, and workshops throughout the day. You have our promise. And now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, this constitution of a housekeeping note, of course, we begin with our first panel of the day, titled Design for Success, Exploring Agile in Public Sector. The guests in this panel will be discussing how technological and social changes have resulted in a renewed thrust to focus on agile governments to better prepare for the future. The moderator for this panel will be introducing the speakers in this discussion. So please join me collectively in welcoming to the stage Director of Research and Advisory at MBRSG, Mr. Fadi Salim. Please welcome.
Assalamu alaikum. Sabah al-khair. I'll ask the distinguished panel also to join me on the panel. Her Excellency Huda Al-Hashmi, Assistant Director General for Strategy and Innovation, Ministry of Cabinet Affairs and the Future. And Mr. Torsten Andersen, Deputy Director General at the Danish Business Authority from Denmark. Welcome. Please have a seat. And Mr. Owen Service, former MD and co-founder of the Behavioral Insight team in the UK, and he's joining us from the UK, as I mentioned. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us early in the morning, and thank you to the audience. It's a pleasure to start the day talking about such an interesting, though complex topic. So let me start by maybe trying to set the scene with the panelists for the rest of the conference. So this panel is about agility in government. Governments in the era of the Fourth Industrial Revolution are facing immense pressures to respond to rising demands by the citizens, by the private sector, by developmental goals, and they are pressed to deliver on wide-ranging and interdependent and complex developmental goals as well, whether the SDGs or their own internal goals and visions. Meanwhile, they have to balance societal transformations and disruptive technological changes. All of this is taking place under high levels of uncertainty and social, political, and technological levels. So how can governments navigate these rapid, double-edged changes in the digital age? How can they do so with agility? In a way, they need to move under fast-moving transformations, although being restricted by very slow-moving legacies of machinery of the government. So how can they do this? More importantly, how can they govern, how can they regulate, how can they develop policies in response to responses and interventions rapidly but safely, with agility that doesn't harm or affect society in doing so. So agile government principles, in a way, are tools are promising to enable governments to anticipate these changes, to adapt to these changes quickly, and to change course flexibly in response to these changes. This entails making major changes to how most governments function today. In a way, if you think about it, it's the opposite of how many governments function today, what we're talking about here. It requires new forms of leadership, new partnerships, new skills, new tools, new instruments and methods. So this panel will try to address these issues, first by explaining and elaborating on what we mean by agile government, and then talking about the tools, the practices that exist today that can help us take the governments of today into a government of the future with agility and ability to respond quickly. And then talk about the challenges a little bit that we face and the future directions that we need to take. And for this, I would like to start with Her Excellency Huda. Her Excellency Huda manages a lot of these elements in the government and under her portfolio that addresses the agility and the innovation that needs to take place to move towards the government of the future. So let me address Huda first with a question. Why agile government? Why do we need it?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I want to say I'm honored to be here amongst you all to give you a bit of a perspective of what we do in the UAE government. I think the word agile government is a new term that not all of us have really practiced. And then this is not a phenomenon that is practiced not just in the UAE, also globally. There's big debate on what does it mean, how does it defined. I'm part of the World Economic Forum Agile Governance team. And in that forum, we're actually asking this question: what does agile government mean? If we look at the Arabic translation of the word, الحكومة المرنة, and we translate it back into English, it means flexibility. And that's not what agile is. It definitely isn't just about flexibility. It has many different components. So in our definition, in the UAE government, it's الحكومة المتقدمة. It's the advanced government. It's the 2.0. And this is where I wanted to deep dive a bit more on what it means. I think the main reason why we need agile government is because we're living in a stage where the change is unprecedented. We've never seen such rapid and exponential change happening around us. And some people think of it as just a technological area with the 4IR. It's actually even broader. It looks at, in terms of climate change, it looks at the migration of people, it looks at many different components. So is government of the past or of today ready to cope with this rapid change? This is a big question. And true, we need innovation, but we also need more than that. The other key thing is, are we ready to handle some of the debates that are happening globally, such as data and privacy? And these debates are happening that we need to understand how can we adapt to actually welcome these debates. The other reason why we need agility is because there's a higher need for adaptability. And adaptability, what we mean by that is that we don't have the luxury of over-planning anymore and strictly implementing our plans. We need to be able to plan, but also plan to give room for adaptability. So in our plans, we actually have to have the space to be adaptable. And this is something that is critical, because if we plan 110%, then we're not going to be welcoming any new areas, new perspectives. The third thing that I wanted to talk about is I think we have an A problem, and this is always the case, is changing expectations. I think if we look at the news and we open the TV, we see that citizens' demands are higher and higher of governments. Their expectations are what they do in their home. It's in a click of a button. So if we ask them to queue or wait for papers in a few days, that's for them not the actual expectation that they are from the. So with that in mind, the changing expectations of citizens means that government also needs to be more agile to actually welcome these changes. But ultimately, it's about agility allows governments to be bolder and have more stronger and bigger ambitions. And for us in the UAE, with the Centennial 2071 plan that our rulers and our leaders have placed on us to be the #1 country in the world, we realize that the world is not standing still.
Thank you.
It's easier, yeah. And this is agility as well, adapting.
Yeah.
Agility is allowing us as nations to be able to put big and bold ambitions and actually get there. That's the main thing, is to actually achieve those big ambitions.
Thank you, Huda. And this is a very good start of what we want to talk about, which is the challenges that we're facing and how we're looking at the journey moving forward. I want to move to Torsten. And Torsten, following up on that, what does agility provide as values to us in government and society, from your perspective, from your experiences in Denmark, but also in practice, what makes the government truly agile? What elements that we need to add in addition to what Huda has highlighted?
Yes. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I'm very honored to speak about agility and future-proofing in the city and a country that is leading the world in this respect. So thank you for that. And in my humble capacity, coming from a small country, I will be happy to speak about our experiences. What we see is that everything that was said just a second ago is very much also true in our context. That there is a need to be more adaptable, more agile, more forward-looking all the time. So we've been trying some different approaches to experiment with how to address it. And you can say that we started sort of on an official governance level, then we moved on to a cultural level, and then to a cooperation with stakeholders level. So let me speak a bit about these three phases, because we started with the very formalistic sense. So we simply tried to do away with the traditional government by reorganizing it and moving around in how we had organized ourselves in silos. For example, we did some new principles for new laws. All new laws had to be future-proof and agile. They had to be digital ready. So basically, everything you do, you have to be able to fully digitize so that in your back office, you also do everything digitally. What we realized fairly quickly was that if you just do this as a tick-the-box exercise for lawyers when they're writing up the laws, it doesn't work. You basically need to move on from the very formalistic sense to a more cultural thing. Another thing we did was to try to put the users at the center of everything we do and enable the uncertainty that comes in this changing dynamic world, letting this uncertainty, taking that away from the companies. So we wanted to give a binding answer across the government for all questions from companies. So we have put up a one-stop shop where you can ask any question to the government, falling between the different government silos. And within 3 months, it doesn't sound very ambitious, but actually it is. For our system, you get a binding answer to any regulatory issue that you may be facing. And again, just putting it on paper, it didn't work. You need to put it into practice with sort of the culture behind it. And then we have very much a focus on working with companies, with stakeholders, with trying to get specific proposals on how we can do things better from the companies. Working with user design-driven innovation approaches, getting these things in and creating this chain of specific proposals for how we improve the way we work. I can speak more about this later.
Yeah, maybe I actually maybe just push you more a little bit on, give us a little bit more about the design elements that you employ and the system thinking approaches that you employ, and how did this actually have been activated or in practice been put in place? That would be helpful.
Yes. I mean, we have tried different things. One thing is digitally. We're tracking now the users of all websites. So that basically, like in a private company, you would always find that users actually are tracked through when you move onto payments and so on. What we realized was that on a government portal we have 1,800 different public solutions in our portal. What we quickly realized was nobody was actually tracking the users, and nobody was experimenting with improving their user experience. So in all the different agencies of the government, people were going about the registration of companies and so on in each their ways and not really optimizing the web pages for the citizens. So that would be one specific example of doing this thing with a user focus. Then we've done a lot of experimentation and testing also on other issues. But I think Owen will speak more about these types of issues.
Yes, and I want to jump to Owen. Owen, you have also experiences in applying some of these tools, and in addition to specifically nudges and behavioral science elements. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about, from your point of view, agility in government, what does it involve, but also the specific practical tools that you think are useful based on your experience that can enact or enable this transformation to take place in practice.
Yes, absolutely. And just before I begin, I'd also like to just say thank you for inviting me here today to talk on this important topic. So my background is in public policy. I used to be a deputy director of what was the Prime Minister's strategy unit, but more recently I helped to co-found and was a former managing director of this outfit called the Behavioral Insights Team, which applies behavioral science, so the study of human decision-making to public policy. And a few years ago, I co-authored a paper that we called Test, Learn, Adapt, which I think is at the heart of what I understand Agile government to be. So you have to be able to find out what's working, but also what's not working in the moment. You have to be able to learn from what's working and what's not working, and then adapt your systems and processes in real time to be able to go with the flow of those things that you find that are working, but also to shut down, have the ability to shut down those things that are not working. And that's why I think tools and processes end up being really important. It's one thing to say that you're going to be agile, it's another to then be able to embed those systems and processes within the government systems that you might be operating. And there are a couple of tools that I think are really critical to doing this. So one of them is, so I mentioned testing and learning. One of them is how you actually do that in practice. And within the UK government, the Behavioural Insights team pioneered an approach to testing borrowed from academia by running these large-scale randomized evaluations that importantly were often focused on small bits of process within the larger system. So most famously, this involved finding out whether or not single lines of a tax letter to somebody who'd failed to pay their tax on time had more of an effect at encouraging people to pay, and that resulted in discoveries like, for example, finding out that if you tell people in the UK that 9 out of 10 people in the UK pay their tax on time, you get about a 2 percentage point increase in tax payments. And that's a good example of how a relatively more agile approach enables you to learn from what's working so that you can then change the way in which, in this case, you communicate with citizens in an area like tax compliance. So that's one tool, which is how do you test? The second is, as Torsten was mentioning, this focus on users. And here I think we can learn a lot from the world of design and design thinking, and apply approaches which are generally called user-centered design. But what I normally say is that the objective should be to really try to understand systems and processes through the eyes of the people who are actually going to be using them. So a simple thing that all of us can do is to become users of our own services. So a simple example of this is in the UK, there's been a lot of emphasis on how do you get somebody to switch their energy supplier in a world in which you might have a choice of many different suppliers of your energy supply. And the first step to that process should be to have a go yourself, to become a user of the very policy that you are enacting. So I think those two tools can be adapted to any given system. One of them is try and become a user of the service yourself, adopting this principle of user-centered design, and then the second is embed that culture of testing and trialing as you go along to find out what works and also, importantly, what doesn't work.
Good. I want to come back to Huda and ask her about specifically the UAE and these practices here. But first, I would put Torsten also on the spot, and I want to ask him about the business community. How do you, in this potential agile approach, how do you involve them? You also work in the business authority, in the business development authority. So how do you involve the business community, the startups, the innovation ecosystem, if you like, within these elements of agility in the government?
We have different ways. I mean, one way is through challenges. So putting out challenges for solving specific societal problems that you want to achieve, carbon neutrality in different sectors, for example, or these types of issues, acceleration programs, so on. So that would be more on the business support side. And then on the other side, we have this very important channel of business suggestions into the government, where you would be able to come up with any proposal, and the government will have to comply or explain why it doesn't with a real proposal or with a real reason. Not just a thank you for your letter. Unfortunately, we're not in a position to do something about it. Best regards, the minister. So basically, it requires that the highest level of government wants to get these input, and wants to really have let's say, the needs of the users taken seriously. And based on that, we've been doing many reforms of, for example, our taxation systems. We used to have, for example, 14 different tax VAT for nuts, so different types of nuts. And basically, we realized that there was just too much bureaucracy in that, so let's get away with that. Let's just have one code, and basically that came from the business community as one example. But by now we've implemented more than 600 very specific ideas coming from the businesses.
Excellent. So Huda, what have we been doing here in the UAE on, based on these examples, or maybe other examples that you can share with us and the audience? Sorry, Deb.
I think before diving into what we've been doing, it's important to sort of maybe say, what does agility include? I think when we first started to hear about the word agility, we all looked at it as a perspective of project management and technology in project management. And that's where it came from. It came from the IT sector, but in government it means something entirely different. So with us in the UAE government, we are working very strongly in actually defining this so that it could come out into practice. And one of the key areas is that agility is about balance. It's not about constant change. It's not always about disrupting. It's true agility is about balancing between transformation and stability to achieve resilience. And this is a big important message, is that I think some people have the misconception that agility means you always have to disrupt, and it isn't. Sometimes it's about stabilizing and being resilient. The other key things that we're looking at in government is in agility is in the core functions of government, the machinery of government. And for that, we need to look at how can we be an agile government when it comes to our finance and how we actually do our budgeting. How does it come in terms of how we actually employ individuals in our HR laws? Do we have suggestions such as part-time work? Do we have flexi hours? These are all examples of agility. And I think our HR laws permit that. Areas such as in terms of planning, which I mentioned earlier, does our strategy allow us to give room for agility in terms of planning as well? Does our KPIs allow us to provide that? So in order to move towards a pure agile government, we need to re-look at some of our key principles as well. And as a person who actually reviews policies for cabinet, one of the things that we look at is policies tend to take a very long time to develop, and rightfully so. But there should be an introduction of another track as well. Imagine if there's a track for policy that is more of an agile-based track, which allows for areas where there is more vagueness. And the areas that are more vagueness are related to the 4IR, where probably we still don't have evidence or facts to tell us, to guide us on which policy that should be enacted into a law. So these are some of the areas that we are looking at in government in terms of actually looking at how we develop policies. Can we do it co-creation with the industry? Can we leave room for actually experimenting some of the outcomes of the policy before it goes into law? So these are some of the areas. And lastly is the area of culture, and I think that's always the hardest thing to do. When we started the innovation, when His Highness announced the year of 2015 as a year of innovation, we started out with the idea of misconception that people had innovation was invention, that it's a myth, that it's only for scientists. A lot of hard work went to actually change that behavior and culture, that actually innovation is embedded in government work as well. Similarly, we believe that the journey for agility will be a similar track. We're celebrating the 5th year of Innovation Month now, and I think if you ask anybody in this room, I think everybody knows what innovation is and what it means to them and how they can practice it in their government. But in agility, it needs to go through a similar track as well.
Great. So in that sense, are there some examples that you can share with us on what the UAE have been doing towards achieving these goals?
I think one of the examples that we've done, which is the government accelerators. Our government accelerator was announced by His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, Naib Rais Al-Dawla, Rais Majlis Al-Wuzara, Hakim Dubai Ra'ah Allah, 3 years ago. He announced this out of a need, and the need was to actually have on-ground, real implementation of the high-priority projects in less than 100 days. So, with that target in mind, and these are really tough challenges that he puts ahead of us, with that in mind, we realize that it cannot be business as usual. It cannot be the same structures that we have. It cannot be the same methodology of working. It cannot be the same space or bureaucracy or letters or committees that is things. So we created an agile environment. And the agile environment is what led to the successes of the challenges that happen in the government accelerators. We are now, this week we launched our 6th cohort. We've celebrated over 40 challenges that have gone through this journey. Some of the areas that resonate with this journey is, one is the cross-entity collaboration. They don't belong to entities, they belong to the challenge. And with that in mind, when they say they belong to the challenge, there is no hierarchy when they work together. They work as a true team to actually address the big challenge. The other key thing is the crisis mode mentality. Since they have only 100 days to actually tackle the challenges on the ground, they don't have room to actually overplan or to overthink. They actually have to experiment. They have to try and error and fail and reiterate and try again and adapt. So this is what allows them to do that. The other main thing is the empowerment of the people. It's the people who are on the front end are the ones that are in the government accelerators. They have the permission and the safety net to actually take the risks that will allow them to push the envelope, that will allow them to do this. All of these principles are the principles of an agile government, and it's practiced through the government accelerator.
That's a great example. And you mentioned one of the words that you highlighted several times is challenges. So they are in a way responses to challenges in governance, but they also produce their own challenges in the way that we respond to them. And I want to move to Torsten and Owen and ask about such challenges of this transformation. So governments, as they are today in the majority of when we talk about government, they're more hierarchical, bureaucratic, highly regulated, solid decision-making hierarchy and systems. But when we talk about this agility that you highlighted in your examples and when Huda highlighted in her examples, they tend to be the opposite. It's like risk-taking, experimental, let's explore and experiment, and then if it works, it works. If it fails, it's not a big deal. This is very different than the culture of government in most cases. So what are the other challenges that we are facing or we can anticipate going into this transformation from this traditional type of doing business in government to this more agile approach? Torsten, I'll start with you. Based on your experience and the experimentations you've done and the work you've done there in Denmark, what challenges did you face? What lessons did you extract based on those?
Yes, thanks. I think the lesson from our side is actually also that you shouldn't overreact to this, because if you move everything, for example, to an innovation unit and say that all new things should come from an innovation unit, that's also difficult then in practice to sort of transform government sustainably. So I think, for example, for developing an IT system that actually works in each of the agencies that are very user-friendly and so on, before I spoke about how they didn't fit together across government, but for them to be able to be truly good, well-functioning, they need to be very close to the material issues. So you basically need to have the old lawyers that you also had before the fourth industrial revolution that were sitting and doing the job that a lawyer does, still has to be the one now programming the IT system in the modern world. But he still has to know about company law, or he still has to know about the specifics of accounting standards in order to be able to. You need a lawyer that's also a programmer. So I think what we did wrong was that we tried too much to sort of take away the innovation from the core of the issues, and that turned out to be a problem. Also, when you want to scale up the innovation.
Well, excellent. So this is a thing about capacity in one way and culture in another. I'll move to Owen. And Owen, also, what are the, in your view, in your experiences, the challenges of applying these, whether it's applying behavioral insight elements and also the culture that may resist it, or any other cultural or challenges that you faced based on your experience?
So I think if you're trying to put in place a completely new approach, there is a challenge of being able to build credibility in terms of that approach, especially in the early days. I think it's inevitable in a big system of government that's used to doing things in a particular way, that there will be some skepticism to any new approach. It could be in the concept of agile government in itself. It could be in the application of behavioral science or any other kind of new way of doing things. And so the thing that I normally say is it's worth thinking about, in line with the approach of agile governance, to start small and to pick off one or two areas that enables you to demonstrate impact before then trying to scale up. So that's one thing. It's about being able to build your credibility, but not trying to bite off more than you can chew too soon. And you can do, but the point being, you can do that very, very quickly if you focus on a small area, like the kind of thing that I mentioned earlier around tax compliance. And the second, I would agree with what Torsten has just said in terms of people. The mistake that I think is often made is that you either say, let's try this new approach, but let's use an existing team of people to put it into practice, and then it doesn't take off because those individuals may not be used to working in a new or different way. But the parallel mistake is that you try and get a team of outsiders to come in and put that new practice into place that maybe they're used to doing in a completely different context. And in my experience, that doesn't work either, because those individuals don't have the knowledge of how the systems and the processes work in practice. So the solution is obviously to combine those two sorts of mentalities. You need people who really understand how government works, but are up for doing things differently. But you also need outsiders who can bring new skills and experiences to bear. And that could be individuals from the private sector, but equally it can be people in academia who've been developing new practices but don't necessarily have a route through to making something happen.
Yeah, please, Huda, you want to comment?
To add to what you're saying in practice, I think it reminded me of one of the challenges that we had in the Government Accelerator. One of the challenges was to reduce the carbon, to improve air quality in the city. We measure that, it's a national KPI in the UAE. And to bring that to text, we looked at how can we reduce carbon emissions from cars by 240,000 cars, roughly. And it was a championship, something that was run by the Ministry of Climate Change and the Environment. And to do that, we realized it can't be just the staff from the Ministry of Climate Change to actually make that challenge happen. And in the usual context, that's what it would have been. Because it's under the ministry, they would have to tackle it themselves, they would have to get the buy-in and so forth. But when it came to the Government Accelerator, the ministry came with a completely different aspect. They looked at it as like, who's the cause of the emissions? And they looked at the industrial area, and they highlighted one specific industry, which was our aluminium industry, that was causing most of the air pollution. And they said, why don't we bring them on board? So they were part of the team that was actually tasked to solve that challenge. And then they said, well, who has the solution to help us limit that air quality? And they looked around and they said, actually, GE is. So GE, IMAL, and the Ministry of Climate Change came together to solve a national KPI, which is improving the air quality. And how they did that was actually really defining an ambitious goal. In 100 days, we want to reduce it by 240,000 cars. And this is not a plan, this is actual changes in the factories, actual changes in the way they do business, actual way in actually the emission goes through. I'm proud to say that in 100 days, they actually reduced it by 480,000 cars. Nice. So this is something that we say, but when you look at different sectors and you bring them together, so you have the government know-how, but you have the different perspective as well, and you have the buy-in from the private sector, really ambitious goals get met, and with no additional cost to government as well.
And I mean, this is an excellent example. It's an experiment, a response to something that is critical, and it brought together multiple stakeholders, and they achieved something. Now, the question, and maybe the question to all of the panelists here, is how do you scale this up? You succeeded in achieving something by applying these methods quickly, fast, rapidly, with relative success, and then maybe you need to enact policies. Maybe you need to scale it up across government, across society. How do you do that? How do you go through the change and the transformation? Anybody wants to start commenting on this? What's the scale-up approach based on these small elements and nudges that you created? How do you scale it up? And then I can move on to others as well.
Yeah, so I think scaling is crucial. There's no point in setting out to achieve an objective if you don't have scale in mind, and I think that's part of the solution, which is it's almost one of the first questions that you ask. It's not the last question that you ask. One of the mistakes that I think is often made is to say, hey, we've done this project on a small scale, how do we go about scaling? That's the wrong way round. The first question that you should be asking is how are we going to reach scale once this project is delivered? And then the second is, I think the example that we just heard is a fantastic example of Agile government in practice, because it's focused on the very practical aspect of solving a problem as you go, rather than the maybe more traditional approach, which would be to say, let's run a policy project and then present the findings of this policy project and then think about implementation after the event. So implementing while you're doing, I think, is part of the process of being an Agile government, but it also helps you to then reveal that path through to scaling. And then the last point I'd make is that sometimes scaling is very simple and straightforward. If you're doing something like changing the way that you communicate with citizens around their tax compliance, you're effectively just changing existing systems and processes, and you can scale overnight. Sometimes it's much more complex. So an example from my work would have previously been changing the way in which we help and support people back into work through the network of job centres that operate across the United Kingdom. There, when you're thinking about scaling, you have to think about the training programs that you need to put in place for the delivery of face-to-face services. But I'll start where I began, which is to say that needs to be part of your focus of your project from the very get-go, rather than something that you consider at the final stage.
Great. Torsten,
Yes.
how do you scale up?
I think the point about the Agile work method actually being in its sort of project management sense about doing rather than talking or describing is what will enable the scale up at a later stage. And then I was very encouraged to hear that the way that you've worked with the challenges here are very anchored at the top level, because I think a risk of working, which I was trying to say just a second ago, in a new way, is that you just sort of double the different hierarchies, and then you end up being less agile rather than more agile if you do sort of a project management set up on top of a classical hierarchy. Then it's better actually to just have the old-fashioned hierarchy. But when you're able to work in this new way, where you actually anchor it at the top level and with the decision makers, and you move with prototypes, user design thinking, and move very quickly ahead, that is the spot-on way to do it.
That's great. Huda, maybe you can also, I mean, this is on the same question. So did this move, maybe I ask you about this specific examples if it's possible. Did it move to be enacted into some policy instrument? Did it expand to beyond that specific experiment?
I think the main thing is with this methodology, it has three main phases. The first phase is the design phase, is getting the commitment of people, rallying up the different individuals, defining what the challenge is. And then the second phase is the actual 100-day ticking bomb. Literally, we call it a ticking bomb, where it actually literally ends on the 100th day. The third phase, with which I totally agree, is the most important phase, is the scalability. So in day 50, the team actually actively work on the scalability idea. The idea behind the Accelerator is you can't do everything in 100 days. We realize that. It's not realistic to do so many things in 100 days. But it's important to prove that it can be done. Because people tend to say it's impossible to do this. And we know the word impossible doesn't belong in the UAE's dictionary. How can we do that? By proving either through specific regions or specific cohorts or specific areas that it's possible, and then immediately scaling it up. During the Accelerator, MOUs are signed, memos of policies are drafted as well. In fact, 3 laws were signed, finished off during the Accelerator. One of the examples we had was a one-day court system. So in 100 days, the judges designed the one-day court system, designed the lawa'ih of the law, and actually made it happen as well. So this way, it's not just a nice achievement, it's sustainable. But if I was to really say scalability, it's also about building the capability of the people. Because there's a limit of how much you can put in an accelerator. There's capacity issues as well. It's about building this culture and the capability of the people so that they practice it in their own domains. They don't need a special program, a special platform to actually do this. They reflect us across. And I think the perfect example we have of that is in the Ministry of Human Resource Development. They came to us with one accelerate, was that we wanted to employ 1,000 employees in the finance sector in 100 days. Actual employees in their jobs. So not an intent, not a contract, but actually they're physically in their jobs in 100 days. They achieved that. Because they achieved that, the next cohort, they did that with different industries, the telecom industry, the real estate industry, and so forth. And now, actually, they have a government accelerator practice in their ministry as well. So this has become a culture within that ministry, and they're championing it regularly. So they no longer need to come to the platform because it's an embedded culture within their ministry as well. And I think that's one of the most critical things, is the scalability is through the capability building and the buy-in as well.
And that's an excellent point, because in one way, you mentioned balance and trade-offs. And there are the balances and the trade-off of what the government does requires a lot of change management. And these change management include people, and people require skills to be able to adapt, soft or hard skills. And I want to ask Torsten and Owen about these elements. So in your so start with Owen. Back in your days in the Prime Minister's office, did you look when you applied the nudge unit, for example, when you applied these elements, did you take into consideration, okay, this requires these kind of capabilities to enact this, to scale it up, to move beyond just a nice example and experiment? And did you actually go through this painful process of change management with people, or was it somebody else's problem?
So in my days in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, there were things that I think we got right, and there were other things that I think we got wrong. So the things that we got right were in line with the approach that I was saying before, which was that we would actively create teams of people with complementary sets of skills. So typically, a project team would be composed of someone who came from a civil service background. Often somebody was on secondment from a department, so they had a deep understanding of that policy area. Somebody would come from a private sector background, so they may, for example, have come from a consultancy, again with some knowledge and some expertise in that field, but also in terms of the wider data analysis type skills. And then there would often be somebody from academia who was coming from a very different perspective in relation to that area. So that kind of blend of different skills meant that you would often come up with new perspectives on a problem that had been looked at for many years. The thing that we got wrong, so this is more than 10 years ago, was precisely the kind of things that we've been talking about today. So we had a very project-focused approach to the delivery of a 100-page slide deck at the end of the process. and we didn't take that user-centered approach to the way in which we ran those programs. And in some respects, I often say that when we set up the behavioral insights team, we were very cognizant of those problems, and we turned that model on its head. So instead of looking from the high-level strategic as the starting point, we would look through the eyes of the user and focus often on the kind of the details of the process before thinking about what that meant for the system as a whole.
Great. Torsten, what did you, in terms of capabilities and skills and people, do you look into these things? You involved the private sector in doing these things?
Yes, I mean, very much. In our agency, we're also still working a lot with this. Right now, we've set up a number of internal training programs for how you actually work agile in an agile way. Starting from where we also started this panel, the first challenge is, of course, to create a common understanding of what is actually agile, where you have, I mean, some people are working in the more project management type agility, and others are thinking design thinking and 3-day user sprints. And what we realized is that they're actually complementary. So you can use both. So we've educated a lot of internal policy coaches. That's what we call them, where you then are able to either use the one tool or the other, depending on the problem you're looking to solve. So either you could do like in the IT field, where you sort of have a core team sitting together for a month and doing something, or you can and then you have the stand-ups with every week, or you can do the other thing, which is basically taking people from all across the organization for 3 days, if they're the real decision makers and the ones that will make the change, and then taking them back to work afterwards. So using the different approaches depending on the project, that's sort of the specific thing. So that's one thing, is the sort of the project managed type of work, and then the other thing is the user needs and the testing, experimentation, prototyping. That's the other place where we really saw that our employees needed new skills in order to be able to work more agile.
We're almost getting out of time, but I want to ask all of the panelists to, from their point of view and their experiences collectively, if you are advising a government entity, a government agency, a ministry specifically, on employing or applying these methods and culturally changing their ways and going towards more agile approaches in responding to these challenges. If you want to list 1, 2, or 3 issues or advice that you want to give the entity to start with, moving from that highly bureaucratic, highly regulated, solid system of doing business in government into a more responsive, agile approach. I want to end with Huda, so I will start with Owen, if you like. And what are these 3 things that they need to focus on as an entity, as a government entity, as an agency?
Okay, so I will go back to a couple of things that I've mentioned as being, I think, particularly important. So one of them is the people side of things. So I think you really need to focus on getting the right people in, ideally people who have done this before, but not to assume that they're going to be able to do it all by themselves. So doing that in combination with people within inside your existing systems who they can work with. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that's really critical, which is not assuming that outsiders can do it all by themselves, but also not assuming that insiders can do it by themselves. It's the combination that will make things work. And then the second is another thing that I mentioned briefly earlier, which is I think that if you're taking a kind of radically new approach, you need to start small. You need to focus on 1 or 2 areas where there is a clear problem, but maybe not the thing which everybody is focused on as being the most critical thing for your department or your ministry. So it's perfectly acceptable to say, let's focus on the area that is actually not the most interesting issue, the thing that you can therefore have more legitimacy or license to try a new approach in relation to, and not being afraid to say it's okay if we just focus on a small aspect of this process in order to demonstrate whether or not this new approach can work. So those two things, people and then starting small.
Very good. Torsten?
Yes, I think that's two very good ways of starting, but I think one thing that is particularly important is sort of the real will at the top. I mean, it's not just that you should sort of say that you want this or do it for window dressing. You should actually want to work in a new way, and you should actually have the courage also to do it. And I think something that is mentioned a lot here is this thing about failing fast, and the culture of failing, which sounds very bad when you fail, but the whole idea of failing fast is that then you fail small, and then you don't fail big. And I think this whole way of starting from the top, testing something, see if it works in this specific context, and then learning from it, adapting, moving on. And then I think very practically that there are a lot of tools that's simply there to start out with. I mean, for example, on how you actually find out the real needs of users and not just what you think are the needs, and all of the behavioral insights that Owen is talking about, or the project methodology, or foresight thinking, scenario planning. There are all challenges to be put out to the private sector. It's all about just starting somewhere.
Excellent, thank you. So Huda, to close with you, I mean, maybe you have some advice, some specific advice to the different the agencies that want to apply these methods and approaches. But before you maybe provide this advice, I want to ask you what's next for Agile in the UAE in general, for us to plan to respond to if we are government, working in the government, and how we can align with your vision.
I think if I may, the what's next and the advice, I think I can combine it.
Yeah.
If I was to summarize it to four main components, I think agility depends on key attributes, and if we say what's next is that if we can really practice these key attributes. So one of the first attributes is empowerment, and empowerment, it means that true governments around the world are trying to minimize risk, but if we give the opportunity to empower employees to take risks in calculated risks so that they can actually move towards really bringing improvement to people's lives, and maybe that's something. So in a way, giving them a degree of autonomy in order to allow faster turnaround rather than fail in a much larger scale, which is what we don't want. So I think empowerment is a key attribute. The second attribute is preemptiveness. And this is so much more important now than ever, with the fact that there's something about future foresight. Are we as a government ready and preempting the future trends that are coming our way? Are we adapting our thinking, our strategies, our policies, our programs, our services to the new trends that are our way? Or are we actually pushing it back? So the preemptiveness is critical. There are some things we cannot preempt. I think nobody foresaw the coronavirus epidemic that came this way, and its impact in tourism, economies, globally. But it's how governments react to these surprises and how preemptive they are in their measures to be able to pivot, to react to such phenomena that come our way. The third thing is flexibility, and flexibility is I struggle with that word because I feel it's a bit light, but flexibility is in the sense that responding effectively, fast, to things that are exciting, new ideas, embracing it, being flexible. Flexibility is also in the aspect of service. Sometimes we have very rigid service protocols. So if a customer comes our way, we only follow those protocols. But sometimes we need to go beyond that and be more flexible to a specific need that comes our way. And so this is where we sort of expand the horizon on flexibility. But if I was to end in the key attribute, I would say it's vision-drivedness, and it goes back to your point. We are in the year of towards planning for the next 50. And that is critical. And no nation has announced that it's planning such long ahead. And we're looking at how can we be prepared to be, to plan, to strategize, to push the envelope, to organize and to execute activities today so we can reap the benefits in the next 50 years. And that's what this year is about, and that's what our main focus is, and that's why agile government is so critical to go hand in hand towards planning and really pushing the envelope so that we can stand strong and be proud of of being able to achieve our leadership's strong and ambitious vision for our country.
It's a great point to end on. So thank you very much, Huda. Thank you, Torsten. Thank you, Owen, for these insightful contributions. And I'm sure a lot of people were taking notes and planning forward. And in one way, to close before the end of the session, to quote one of the articles in the current edition of the Dubai Policy Review on Agile Government was that sometimes people think about agility in terms of simplifications. Other times it's about deregulations, and in other formats it's about digitization. But you cannot achieve either of these without the other in one way or another. So it's a combination of the flexible ways of thinking things, going to simplify, centricity of people, and digitization in many cases combined that can also lead into these. So hopefully you've enjoyed some of and captured some of the thoughts that were made here today. I would like to thank the panelists again, and thank you for listening, and moving forward to the next Impulse Talk. And Owen will give us some more practical cases about policy, technology, and behavioral insights or behavioral science, and how this can help. Thank you again. Please join me in panelists for their contribution. Thank you.
For Mr. Fadi and all the panelists, as well as Mr. Fadi's really enjoying the day. He kind of broke the spoiler of introducing Mr. Owen, which we will come to very shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a conclusion or a sum up to this wonderful session, it is the word agility, and it's such a big word. Has many meanings, of course. It could apply to species like the dinosaurs. In such a case, they couldn't adapt, regardless of whether it was a meteor or whether it was some sort of a cold disaster. And in another word as well, it could apply to human beings in which it would be a combination of balance, coordination, speed, reflexes, strength, and endurance and stamina. You need balance to govern through all of those, which is also agility. But in companies as well, it may apply to one thing, phases. Of course, in companies and in governments and in organizations, agile developments and processes, if I am, of course, not correct, Mr. Owen. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on, we have two compelling options for our audience today. I would like to invite you to stay in your seats for our first impulse, which is a guest talk covering technology, policy, and behavioral science. Or if you have registered for our first workshop of the day, the topic covered will be emotional intelligence, which is the next evolution in human consciousness by Meraki, and you are welcome to attend it as well in Al-Waha meeting room. Now, ladies and gentlemen, for our first impulse, please allow me to welcome to the stage former Managing Director and co-founder of Behavioral Insights team from the United Kingdom, Mr. Owen Sevis.
Onto the screen now. Here we go. So I've talked about the policy work that I've been involved in the past, but my new interest is around how scaling technology companies with a mission, especially a policy mission, can help us to solve some of the problems that we face as government and as citizens. So I'm going to talk about technology, policy, and behavioral science. And to do that, I need to just give you a bit of a background to what behavioral science actually is. and then I'm going to give you a few examples of the kind of mission-driven technology companies that I'm talking about. Who here has heard of behavioral science? Just put your hand in the air if you feel like you know a bit about behavioral science already, and it will help me to sort of pitch how I talk about this. So it's definitely the minority of you. The founding fathers of the field of behavioral science are generally considered to be these two here. This is Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. And probably Daniel Kahneman is now most famous, having won the Nobel Prize in 2002 for a lot of the work that he did with his now late partner Amos Tversky. One of the founding principles of their work is that we have two different ways of processing information and taking decisions, which are at the heart of Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. We have a fast system and we have a slow system. And the easiest way to think about this is if somebody says to you, what is 1 + 1, a number will pop into your head almost automatically, whether you want it to or not. You don't have to actively think about what the answer to that question is. Or if somebody says to you, what is the color of grass? Green will pop into your head whether you want it to or not. If you're walking along a pavement at a leisurely pace, you don't have to actively think about the steps that you're taking. You do so more or less automatically. And almost every decision that you take on a day-to-day basis will be made using this fast thinking system. But you also have a parallel system at play. It's your slow system, which is much more reflective and requires your active attention. So if somebody says to you, what is 17 times 14? A number will not pop into your head unless you're a very accomplished mathematician. You will need to actively think about it and give it your attention. If somebody asks you to undertake that task of walking down a pavement or through a hotel lobby, but to do so at a faster than average pace, you'll find that it's actually quite challenging for you to do. It requires you to stop and to almost think about it before you're able to do it in practice. I would encourage you to try it after this session. So you have a fast thinking system which governs almost all of your decision making, and then a slow, more reflective system which requires your active attention. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is that a lot of policy is made, and I'm saying this with my former hat as policymaker in the UK central government. A lot of policy is made as if we're often using that slower, more reflective system. Okay, so if you take something like health, and you're trying to get somebody to eat more healthily, you might assume that if you gave somebody some information, well, firstly, they would read that information. Secondly, they would digest the information and understand what it might mean for them. Thirdly, they would use that information to change their behavior. But when we stop and think about a lot of the time, that's not what happens in practice, and that's because we're making these more impulsive decisions. Thank you. We're making those automatic decisions much more often than we think we are. So, what does this mean in practice? Well, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, they laid the foundations for this approach of behavioral science. But then these two guys came along. This is Richard Thaler, who also won the Nobel Prize for Economics a couple of years ago. And his co-author, Cass Sunstein, who's a lawyer by background. And they wrote this book, Nudge, and they helped me a couple of years later to set up the Behavioral Insights team, which is why some people refer to it as the Nudge unit. And their kind of central insight were twofold. So one of them is that if you look at traditional economic models, they're often put in place as if individuals are constantly undertaking cost-benefit analyses, weighing up the decisions that we're taking, like econometricians. So they say, well, actually, we're not the econs of these economic models. We are human beings that apply this fast thinking system to a lot of the decisions that we make. And the principal insight is that it's quite difficult to encourage somebody or to help somebody to change the way in which they take decisions, to change their mindsets, but it's quite simple and straightforward to change the context in which those decisions are made. So they use this word choice architecture to describe the way in which you might be able to redesign the environment in which those decisions are taken in order to go more with the flow of human decision making. So if I go back to my example of healthy eating, one of the first examples in the book Nudge is that instead of trying to provide somebody with information in order to change the choices they might make in a canteen or when you go to a buffet in a hotel conference, you change the structure of the canteen or the buffet to encourage people to make different choices, which might involve, for example, putting healthier options to the front and less healthy options out of reach or even out of sight. And the archetypal example of a nudge is instead of assuming that somebody's going to search the market for the best pension for themselves, start by automatically enrolling them onto a pension plan and give them the choice to opt out. And in the UK, that policy has helped about 9 million more people to save for their retirement. So over the last 10 years or so, I've been thinking about how these insights can be applied to policy directly. But over the last year, my main interest has become in how technology companies can use these same ideas and insights to achieve policy objectives. So I thought I'd give you 3 examples of this in practice. And I think, going back to the conversation that we were just having, this can be something which can be actively encouraged by governments, but very often it's something that requires you to accept that there will be organizations or companies that need to be one part removed from government that are supporting initiatives in a completely different way. So here's one example which I was actually involved in setting up a couple of years ago. It's called Applied, and the mission of Applied is to help organizations, governments, companies, charities to change the way in which they undertake their hiring decisions. So as we know, when we're undertaking recruitment practices, almost whether we want to or not, because of that fast thinking system, we're all subject to these implicit biases in the way that we recruit individuals. When we see the name of an individual, it has an effect upon our judgment of that individual. When we think about things like the order in which we might review a particular application, it has an effect upon the decision that we take, whether we want it to or not. Typically, just as an aside, typically we give a slightly higher mark to the first application that we see. And then we tend to graduate down until we find a particular level. So what Applied does is it enables an organization to apply the latest research and thinking from the behavioral sciences to the way in which you might undertake your recruitment campaign. So for example, you never find out who has submitted a particular application until you've marked all of the individual's scripts. You don't get somebody to write a CV and a cover letter, which is a traditional application process. You ask individuals to respond to specific work-related questions and tasks, and everybody responds to those same questions, and they're marked side by side rather than the top of an application to the end, which again is the traditional way in which this is done. And the point, going back to what I was saying about choice architecture, is that the structure of the decision-making and the structure of the process is set based on what we know works and what we know doesn't work. And it's very difficult to do this in a way that doesn't have that process automated through a platform like Applied. Completely different example. The UK government and UK citizens have an issue which relates to the fact that many millions of people have to take out payday loans on a yearly basis. In the UK, there are about 3.5 million people who will take out a payday loan. These are loans that are there to cover you till you get your next paycheck. The average interest rate of a payday loan in the UK is 1,250%, which means that on average, once you've borrowed £100, you have to pay back about £165 within the context of the fact that these are relatively short-term loans with very, very high interest rates. Now, traditionally, the UK government has thought, well, what tools have we got at our disposal to help this problem, and has been actively participating in this area. So, for example, you can do things like you can cap the interest rates, or you can ban particular practices. But what you can't do, very easily anyway, is to set up whole new processes and systems that enable you to tackle this problem from a completely different perspective. So one of the companies that I now work with is called WageStream, and they are disrupting the market for payday lending. And what they've done is they've built a product which plugs into company or organizational payroll systems, and then enables individual employees to draw down income that they have already earned but haven't yet been paid. Right? So instead of a 1,250% interest rate, you pay a small administration fee of £1.75 to undertake the transaction. They now have 250,000 users. They will probably have 500,000 users by the end of the summer. And as I say, they're disrupting this market for payday lending, but it's not being done by the government. It's being done outside of government channels, but with the active support and encouragement of officials within the system. So that's my second example. My third example is a company called Kogo. Now, governments around the world are looking at climate change, and there are big structural issues that we're all cognizant of that will need to be addressed. But one of the things that is often said is that we need to be able to have a world in which, sorry, my clicker also seems to be taking some fast decisions of its own. So I'm going to attempt to override it with my slow thinking system. So one of the things that Kogo enables and facilitates is this notion that we're all going to have to be able to change our individual behavior as well as those structural decisions that might need to be changed. So I think you've actually got a slightly different message to the one that I'm seeing on my screen. So hopefully we haven't spent the last 10 minutes on different screens. Right. So Kogo is an app that enables individuals to say what values they believe in, and then to match those values with the decisions they might be taking on an individual basis. So in practical terms, if you care about, for example, ensuring that you're buying products and services from individual companies that will have a commitment to low carbon, and you're searching for products through Google, you will get search results that are based on those values. So if you're looking for a supermarket, or if you're looking for somewhere to buy a cup of coffee, you will get delivered search results that are compatible with your commitment to low carbon products, or companies that say pay a living wage. Right, so I'm gonna end there, but the message that I think I want to convey is that very often the solution to a policy challenge or problem is not another policy, it's a product. And if we're going to be focusing on this agile approach to government, we need to ensure that we can build the environment in which those products are able to flourish. So thank you for listening, and I'll be having a coffee afterwards if you want to talk about anything that I've discussed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Owen, for such an insightful talk. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Owen has given us a lot to think about and discuss, what we invite you to do right now over the next 20 minutes during a quick coffee break outside in the foyer. Of course, we look forward to seeing you back here shortly for more informative discussions and talks. So keep your eye and ears on the speakers. We'll see you shortly. Bon appetit, everyone. It's just coffee.